Imagine life in Canada during the late 1800s, a time of big changes that affected everything, from how people worked to where they lived. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing, and the landscape of Canada was transforming in ways that shaped its future. Let's explore some of the most important social and economic changes of this period. First, let's talk about the Industrial Revolution. This wasn't just a moment in history, it was a complete game changer. Factories began popping up in urban centers, churning out everything from textiles to tools. People left farms in rural areas to move to cities, drawn by the promise of jobs in factories. While this meant more opportunities for some, it also created overcrowded cities where working conditions were tough. Imagine working long hours in a noisy, dirty factory, all for low pay. That was the reality for many workers, including children, during this time. Now, let's head out west to the gold rush in British Columbia. Gold was discovered in the Fraser River in 1858, sparking a frenzy of fortune seekers. Thousands of miners from around the world flooded into the region, hoping to strike it rich. While some did find gold, most faced harsh conditions and left empty-handed. For First Nations communities, the gold rush brought disruption as settlers overran their lands and strained resources. Another big shift came with the Reciprocity Treaty of 1854, which allowed free trade between British North America, what we now call Canada, and the United States. This deal was a boon for farmers and fishers, who could now sell their goods across the border without tariffs. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. When the treaty was cancelled in 1866, Canada had to scramble to find new markets, leading to the push for confederation and more economic self-reliance. Speaking of trade, the Corn Laws in Britain played a major role in Canada's economy. These laws, which once gave Canadian farmers a guaranteed market for their grain, were repealed in the 1840s. This left Canadian farmers struggling to compete with cheaper imports, forcing them to adapt and diversify their crops. It was a tough adjustment, but one that eventually helped shape the agricultural industry. Meanwhile, the decline of the buffalo on the prairies had devastating effects on Plains First Nations and Métis communities. Buffalo were a critical resource, providing food, clothing, and tools. As settlers moved west and overhunted the buffalo, these communities faced food shortages and were forced to rely on government rations, if they were available. This loss of independence was a huge blow. In the Arctic, Inuit involvement in the whale oil industry brought new challenges and opportunities. Inuit communities worked with European whalers, sharing their expertise in navigating the icy waters and hunting whales. While this cooperation brought economic benefits, it also disrupted traditional ways of life and introduced new risks, like exposure to disease. Let's not forget the boom in immigration during this period. People from Europe poured into Canada, lured by promises of land and opportunity. Settlers moved west, turning prairies into farmland and expanding towns and cities. But this expansion wasn't without consequences. Indigenous peoples were often displaced, and tensions arose as newcomers brought different languages, cultures, and beliefs. Finally, urban centers grew rapidly. Cities like Toronto and Montreal became bustling hubs of activity, fueled by industry and immigration. But with rapid growth came challenges like overcrowded housing, poor sanitation, and social inequality. Women began to organize, pushing for better working conditions and more rights. These movements planted the seeds for future social reforms. The changes of this period weren't easy, and they weren't fair to everyone. While settlers and business owners often thrived, Indigenous communities and workers faced significant hardships. But this era also laid the groundwork for Canada's future as a diverse and industrialized nation.